Imagine spending 4 years of your life preparing for a single moment. Every wire checked, every circuit tested, every failsafe verified, then verified again. You have done everything right. You have followed every protocol. You have built redundancy into redundancy because you understand that in war things fail. And then in 11 minutes it all falls apart, not because you made a mistake, but because the universe simply refused to cooperate. This is the story of Major Scheller, a German officer who did everything by the book, who prepared the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen for demolition with such meticulous care that it should have been impossible, literally impossible, for that bridge to survive. And yet on March 7, 1945, American soldiers ran across that bridge while it was still standing. They shouldn't have been there. The bridge shouldn't have held. And 7 days later, Major Scheller was standing in front of a firing squad, not shot by the Americans. Shot by his own side. How does something like that happen? How does a man do everything right and still end up executed for failure? And what does it tell us about the final, desperate months of the Third Reich when the regime started eating its own? Let's go back to the beginning. The Rhine River is not just a river, not to Germans. For over 2,000 years, the Rhine has been Germany's great natural fortress. It's wide, it's fast, it's deep. When Roman legions pushed into Germania, the Rhine was where they stopped. When Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, the Rhine was the barrier that defined the edge of French ambition. The river runs for over 800 miles, cutting through the heart of Europe like a geological boundary between worlds. And in 1945, it was the last major obstacle between the Allied armies and the German heartland. Think about that for a moment. By early March 1945, the Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, pushed through Belgium, survived the desperate German counterattack at the Bulge, and now they were rolling toward Germany itself. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, an industrial war machine that was grinding the Wehrmacht into dust. But the Rhine stood in the way. Now, here's what most people don't realize about crossing a major river during wartime. It's not just about getting soldiers to the other side. It's about getting everything to the other side. Tanks, artillery, trucks, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, hundreds of thousands of tons of material that a modern army needs to keep moving, and all of it has to cross the water. If you don't have a bridge, you have to build one. You have to bring up engineering units, construct pontoon bridges under enemy fire, and pray that German artillery doesn't destroy your crossing before you can establish a bridgehead on the far side. This takes time. It costs lives. It gives the enemy a chance to regroup. But if you capture a bridge intact, if you can get your forces across before the Germans can blow it up, then you've just cracked the Rhine wide open. You've bypassed the fortress. You've created a wound in the German defensive line that can never be closed. The Germans knew this. They knew that every single bridge across the Rhine was a potential catastrophe, which is why by early 1945 they had rigged every bridge for demolition. Every single one. Bridges that had stood for decades, bridges that carried vital rail traffic, bridges that connected communities that had been linked for centuries, all of them wired with explosives, ready to be dropped into the river the moment American forces got too close. And of all those bridges, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was considered one of the most thoroughly prepared. The Ludendorff Bridge wasn't beautiful. It wasn't some architectural masterpiece that tourists came to photograph. It was a railway bridge, built during the First World War to move troops and supplies to the Western Front. 2 massive stone towers anchored each end, and between them stretched a double-track railway line carried by steel trusses. It was functional, industrial, the kind of bridge that existed purely to move material from one place to another. It had been completed in 1918, just months before the armistice ended the First World War. It never saw the heavy use it was designed for. And for the next 26 years, it sat there, carrying local rail traffic, slowly rusting, slowly becoming just another piece of infrastructure that people stopped noticing. But by 1944, the Ludendorff Bridge had become one of the most strategically important structures in Western Germany. Because as the Allies pushed closer, as the front lines contracted, as German forces began their long retreat back toward the fatherland, the Rhine crossings became critical. And Major Scheller was the man responsible for making sure this bridge could be destroyed. Now, I want you to understand something about Scheller. He wasn't a fanatic. He wasn't a true believer screaming about final victory while Berlin burned. He was an engineer in uniform, a professional soldier who approached his job with the methodical precision that German military culture demanded. His task was straightforward: prepare the Ludendorff Bridge for demolition in such a way that when the order came, the bridge would come down. No failures, no excuses, no second chances, and he approached this task with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that should have made failure impossible. Let me walk you through what Scheller prepared. The bridge had 60 demolition chambers. 60. These were specially constructed cavities built into the bridge structure, each designed to hold explosive charges at structurally critical points. You didn't just pack a bridge with dynamite and hope for the best. You placed charges at precise locations where the blast would sever load-bearing elements, causing the entire structure to collapse under its own weight. 60 chambers. Think about that. 60 individual points of failure for anyone trying to save the bridge. But Scheller didn't stop there. He installed a primary electrical detonation circuit. One command, one button, and electrical current would flow to all 60 chambers simultaneously. The charges would detonate in sequence. The bridge would twist, buckle, and drop into the Rhine. Clean, efficient, exactly as German engineering intended. But what if the primary circuit failed? What if American artillery severed the wires? What if there was a short circuit, or water damage, or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong in a combat zone? Scheller installed a backup electrical circuit, a completely redundant system running through different conduits using different connection points. If the primary failed, the backup would work. And what if both electrical systems failed? What if some unimaginable catastrophe took out both circuits simultaneously? Scheller installed a manual ignition option, a mechanical system that would allow German engineers to physically ignite the charges by hand if all else failed. It would take longer, it would be more dangerous, but it would work. Primary system, backup system, manual failsafe, 3 independent methods of destroying the bridge, any one of which should have been sufficient to do the job. And Scheller tested these systems regularly. He verified connections. He checked explosive charges. He conducted drills with the demolition teams so they would know exactly what to do when the moment came. He did everything that a professional officer was supposed to do. For years, Scheller refined his preparations. As the war situation deteriorated, as the Americans got closer, he made sure that when the order came, the Ludendorff Bridge would die on command. He was ready. So what went wrong? Here's the thing about war that staff officers and planners never quite manage to account for. It doesn't care about your preparations. War is chaos with a uniform. And sometimes, the chaos comes at you so fast that all your careful planning becomes irrelevant. By March 1945, the American advance wasn't proceeding according to any timetable. It wasn't the methodical, phase-by-phase operation that the generals had drawn up in their headquarters. It was something more primal, more unpredictable. The German army in the West was collapsing, not in an orderly retreat, not in a fighting withdrawal, but in a kind of institutional disintegration. Units that had held the line for weeks suddenly broke. Commands that should have been transmitted up and down the chain simply vanished into static. Soldiers who had fought with discipline for years threw down their weapons and walked toward the American lines with their hands up. The Americans, sensing this, pushed harder, faster. They didn't wait for supply lines to catch up. They didn't pause to consolidate gains. They moved with what historians would later call industrial velocity, the speed of a military machine that had finally figured out how to translate its overwhelming material advantage into operational momentum. And on March 7, 1945, elements of the American 9th Armored Division were rolling toward the Rhine without any real expectation of what they would find. Let me set the scene for you. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman was commanding a company of American infantry. He was 22 years old. Born in Germany, actually. His family had emigrated to Nebraska when he was a child. Now he was leading American soldiers back into the land of his birth, pushing through the remnants of German resistance, not entirely sure what was waiting for him ahead. When his unit crested the hills overlooking the Rhine Valley, Timmerman expected to see the usual sight. A demolished bridge, its twisted wreckage jutting from the water. Germans dug in on the far side, the crossing that would have to be forced by blood and pontoons. Instead, he saw the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing. You have to understand how shocking this was. Every other Rhine bridge the Americans had approached was already destroyed. The Germans had been methodically blowing crossings for weeks, denying the Allies any intact spans. The standing order was clear, no bridge survives, but there it was, the Ludendorff Bridge, intact. And on the far side, German soldiers were still moving, not defending, but withdrawing, vehicles crossing, troops filing across, a retreat still in progress. Timmerman radioed his superiors. "There's a bridge here, it's still up. What do we do?" The answer came back almost immediately: "Take it." What followed was 11 minutes that changed the course of the war. Here's where everything that Major Scheller had prepared for started falling apart. First problem, the explosives themselves. You see, by March 1945, Germany was running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, and explosives. The industrial-grade demolition charges that Scheller had requisitioned for the bridge, the powerful military explosives that were supposed to guarantee destruction, had been redirected. Sent to other locations deemed more critical. In their place, Scheller's team had received substitute charges, commercial-grade explosives, mining charges. They would work probably, but they weren't as powerful. The margin for error was smaller. Scheller knew this. He had complained about it. He had been told to make do. Second problem, communication breakdown. The German retreat across the Rhine was not orderly. It was a desperate scramble of units trying to get to the east bank before the Americans cut them off. And somewhere in this chaos, the coordination between the retreating forces and the demolition team broke down. Scheller needed to know when to blow the bridge late enough to let friendly forces cross, early enough to stop the Americans. But the information he was receiving was fragmentary, contradictory. The Americans were closer than anyone realized. Third problem, the Americans were not following the script. Military doctrine said that when approaching a defended river crossing, you were supposed to pause, recon the situation, bring up artillery, suppress enemy positions, plan your assault carefully to minimize casualties. You definitely weren't supposed to just charge at a bridge that could explode at any second. But Timmerman's men didn't stop. They didn't wait. They advanced toward the bridge at a speed that caught the Germans completely off guard. As American soldiers approached the western entrance of the bridge, the order finally came through. Blow it. Blow it now. A German engineer named Sergeant Faust, and yes, that was his actual name because sometimes history has a dark sense of humor, triggered the primary detonation circuit. Nothing happened. The primary circuit was dead, severed by American artillery sometime in the previous hours. The wires that should have carried the killing current to 60 demolition chambers were useless. Scheller's backup plan, the secondary circuit. Faust triggered the backup. This time there was an explosion, a massive blast that shook the entire bridge, sent debris flying into the air, and for one terrifying moment, everyone on both sides thought the bridge was coming down. But it didn't. The weaker substitute charges, the commercial explosives that had been provided instead of military-grade material, had detonated, but they hadn't delivered enough force. The bridge shuddered. It buckled. A section of the deck was damaged, but the main structure held. The bridge was wounded. It was still standing. And now the Americans were running across it. Sergeant Alexander Drabick was the first American soldier to cross the Rhine. He sprinted across the damaged bridge deck, past smoking craters, over weakened sections that could have collapsed at any moment, while German small arms fire cracked past him. He had no idea if the bridge was going to finish falling. He just ran. Behind him came more soldiers, then more, then tanks. The 11 minutes from initial assault to secured bridgehead, that's how fast it happened. Major Scheller, watching from the eastern bank, ordered the manual ignition, the third failsafe, the option of last resort. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems. The manual system required engineers to physically approach the demolition chambers under fire. The Americans were already on the bridge. The chaos of combat made any coordinated action nearly impossible. And then, accounts vary on exactly what happened, but the manual system failed too. Some sources suggest the fuses malfunctioned. Others indicate that the engineers simply couldn't reach the ignition points in time. It doesn't matter. The bridge didn't fall. By nightfall, thousands of American soldiers were across the Rhine. Engineers were already working to reinforce the damaged structure. And the last great barrier protecting the German heartland had been breached. Not through some brilliant tactical masterstroke, not through overwhelming force applied at a decisive point. Through chaos, through speed, through the accumulated failures of a dozen small things that should have worked but didn't. Major Scheller had done everything right, and none of it mattered. Now, here's where this story takes its darkest turn. Adolf Hitler learned about the loss of the Remagen Bridge on the evening of March 7th. He was, by all accounts, incandescent with rage. You have to understand the psychological state of the Nazi leadership at this point in the war. They were losing. They knew they were losing, but they couldn't accept it. Every setback was blamed on treachery, on cowardice, on the failure of subordinates to execute orders properly. The system had become a machine for assigning blame rather than solving problems, and the loss of the Remagen Bridge was the kind of setback that demanded blood. Hitler ordered an immediate investigation. He wanted names, he wanted trials, he wanted executions. Someone was going to pay for this humiliation. Major General Rudolf Hübner was dispatched to conduct a flying court-martial. This wasn't a trial in any meaningful sense. There was no presumption of innocence. There was no careful weighing of evidence. There was a supreme leader who wanted vengeance, and officers who knew that their own lives depended on delivering it. 5 German officers were arrested. Major Scheller was among them. The charges were cowardice and dereliction of duty. Never mind that Scheller had prepared the bridge with textbook thoroughness. Never mind that the explosive substitutions had been forced on him by supply shortages. Never mind that the communication breakdown was a systemic failure, not a personal one. None of that mattered. Someone had to be responsible. 4 of the 5 officers were sentenced to death. And on March 14, 1945, exactly 7 days after the Americans crossed the Rhine, Major Scheller was executed by firing squad. Think about that. 7 days, less than 1 week from the moment of failure to the moment of death. No appeal, no review, no consideration of the circumstances that had made success impossible. Just a bullet. And here's the bitter, almost obscene irony of it all. The Ludendorff Bridge collapsed on March 17th. 3 days after Scheller was shot, the bridge finally fell. The damage from the failed demolition, combined with the stress of thousands of vehicles crossing it, combined with American repair efforts that had actually weakened the structure in some ways, all of it finally proved too much. The bridge dropped into the Rhine, killing 28 American engineers who were working on it at the time. So the bridge that Scheller was executed for failing to destroy, it destroyed itself less than 2 weeks later. It was never going to survive. The damage Scheller's team had inflicted, even with inadequate explosives, even with failed circuits, was ultimately fatal, just not fast enough to matter. And there's one more thing, one more detail that makes this story almost unbearable in its futility. The war ended on May 8, 1945, 8 weeks after Scheller was executed. 2 months. 2 months. That's all. Scheller died for failing to delay an enemy advance in a war that was already lost. He was shot for a failure that wouldn't have changed anything even if he had succeeded. Even if the Ludendorff Bridge had dropped into the Rhine on schedule, even if the Americans had been forced to build pontoon bridges, even if the crossing had been delayed by days or weeks, it wouldn't have mattered. The Wehrmacht was broken. The Reich was crumbling. Nothing was going to stop what was coming. Scheller was sacrificed to a system that had already eaten its future. A regime so consumed by the need to assign blame that it destroyed its own officers for failures that were fundamentally beyond their control. So what do we take from this story? What's the lesson buried in the tragedy of Major Scheller and the Ludendorff Bridge? I think there are several. The first is about the limits of planning. Scheller did everything that professional military competence demanded. He built redundancy into his systems. He tested his equipment. He trained his men. He anticipated failures and created fallbacks for those failures. And it still wasn't enough. Because at a certain point, the accumulation of small disasters, supply shortages, communication breakdowns, equipment substitutions, the random luck of artillery shells cutting specific wires, overwhelms any preparation. You cannot plan for chaos. You can only try to survive it. The second lesson is about institutional failure. The Nazi regime's response to the loss of the Remagen Bridge tells us everything we need to know about how totalitarian systems handle setbacks. They don't learn. They don't adapt. They don't ask, what went wrong systemically and how do we fix it? Instead, they find individuals to blame. They make examples. They shoot people pour encourager les autres, as the French say, to encourage the others. But this approach doesn't solve problems. It just ensures that the next failure will also be handled with executions rather than analysis. It creates a culture where officers are afraid to report difficulties, where problems are hidden rather than addressed, where the entire system becomes increasingly divorced from reality because no one dares tell the truth. Scheller's execution didn't prevent other bridges from being lost. It just terrified other officers into silence. And the third lesson, maybe the most important one, is about the randomness of fate in war. Lieutenant Timmerman, the young American officer who led the assault on the bridge, survived the crossing. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He had done something extraordinary, something that would be remembered for generations, and less than 2 months later he was dead, killed in action in Germany just weeks before the war ended. Sergeant Drabick, the first American across the Rhine, survived the war. He went home to Ohio, lived a long life, died in 1993. Sergeant Faust, the German engineer who tried to trigger the demolition, survived. He was captured by the Americans, spent time as a prisoner of war, eventually returned to a Germany that was being rebuilt from ashes. Major Scheller was shot by his own side. Same bridge, same battle, same 11 minutes. And these men's fates scattered in completely different directions, determined by nothing more than the random intersection of circumstances beyond anyone's control. War is not fair. War does not reward virtue or punish vice with any consistency. War is a chaos engine that grinds through human lives according to a logic that no one can predict or control. The Ludendorff Bridge has never been rebuilt. If you go to Remagen today, you can see the twin towers that once anchored the structure, still standing on either bank of the Rhine like silent monuments to something that happened there 80 years ago. There's a museum in one of the towers now. Peace Museum, they call it. Dedicated not to celebrating the battle, but to reflecting on its costs. The Rhine still flows, of course. Wide and powerful, just as it was when Roman legions stared across it 2,000 years ago. Bridges span it now, modern bridges, built for cars and trucks rather than trains and tanks. The river is no longer a barrier. It's just a geographical feature, something you cross without thinking on your way from one part of Europe to another. But in March 1945, for 11 minutes, that river was the hinge of history. And a German officer who did everything right stood on its bank and watched his careful preparations fail, one system after another, until American soldiers were running past him and there was nothing left to do but wait for his own side to come and shoot him. His name was Major Scheller. He was an engineer. He prepared for years. The Americans crossed in 11 minutes. And 7 days later, he was dead. That's the story. That's how it happened. And if there's a single image I want you to take away from this, one picture to hold in your mind, it's this. The bridge finally collapsing into the Rhine on March 17th. Empty, unmanned, 3 days after they shot the man who was supposed to destroy it. The thing he had planned for finally happening when it no longer mattered to anyone. Sometimes the universe just doesn't cooperate with our plans. And sometimes the only response the people in charge can think of is to find someone to blame. Major Scheller was that someone. Remember him. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about how systems fail and how institutions respond to those failures, take a moment to consider how many stories like this have been lost to history. How many men and women did everything right and were punished anyway, their names forgotten, their fates unknown. Scheller's story survived because the battle at Remagen was significant enough to be documented. But there were thousands of others on all sides in all theaters who faced similar injustices in the chaos of war. History remembers the big events, the crossings, the battles, the turning points, but within those events are individual human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control, doing their best to survive systems that were perfectly willing to sacrifice them. That's the real story of war, not the glory, not the strategy, the people. The Rhine had been Germany's fortress for 2,000 years. It took 4 years to wire the Ludendorff Bridge for destruction. It took 11 minutes for American soldiers to cross it. It took 7 days for the Reich to shoot the man who tried to stop them. And it took 80 years for us to sit here today and ask ourselves, what does that tell us about war, about planning, about justice, and about the terrible things that happen when systems start to fail? I don't have easy answers. I'm not sure there are any, but I think the question is worth asking. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.